Hello, welcome back. Now, self-determination for Crimea may be asking too much, at least according to the West. America and Europe's hostility towards the vote is sharply contrasted by their previous enthusiasm for such referendums, some of which were held in the middle of war zones. And as RT's Polly Boyko now reports, there's quite a list.
You don't have to look back far to see how the US and their Western partners have at times encouraged referendums and secessionist splits.
The referendum on self-determination.
Self-determination.
Right to speak their language.
Be recognized by more nations around the world.
Shape their daily lives.
Determine their own future. Must take place.
Like when Kosovo voted to carve itself out of Serbia in 2008.
This is what the birth of a nation looks like.
Thank you, Europe. Thank you, America. Thank you, Great Britain.
In fact, the US backed Kosovo's independence 2 years before the UN judged it was legal, and in doing so set the precedent. Then, after a long and bloody conflict in Sudan, a referendum saw half the country break away in 2011 to create the world's newest country, South Sudan.
The realization of this historic day is a testament to tireless efforts of the people of South Sudan in their search for peace.
The US set up its embassy in the new capital of Juba that very same day. Just last year, off the coast of Argentina, the people of the Falkland Islands voted overwhelmingly to remain British. Here's David Cameron consoling the Argentinian president.
I wanted to raise it specifically with the Argentine president and say it's important that everyone pays attention to this referendum. So I think it was the right thing to do.
Again, in Britain, over 300 years of union could all end this September. Scotland's being allowed to vote on whether to leave the union. The Prime Minister says it's up to Scots to decide their future. Yet for all the talk of self-determination, Crimea's referendum has been denounced as illegal by the G7 group of the world's biggest economies. The US has sent fighter jets close to Russia, deploying them in Poland and Lithuania. It's also preparing sanctions along with the EU. So when it comes to self-determination or territorial integrity, your guess is as good as anybody's in predicting which way international powers will side. The biggest clue is whether it fits their own interests. Polly Boyko, RT, London.
Now, when it came to direct pressure on Russia, Western nations have been trying to squeeze the Kremlin with threats of sanctions. But let's have a look at Europe's interests in economic ties with Moscow. Well, Russia is the EU's third largest commercial partner, with trade worth more than 300 billion euros. France has been counting on a €1 billion warship sale to Moscow. Most of Europe's cars are sold to Russia, as the country holds the title of the bloc's largest automobile market. And the winter might be over, but the EU still buys almost a third of its gas from Moscow. London, meanwhile, has enjoyed luxury property sales to Russians worth $500 million. Plus, every year, Russians spend €70 million in UK school fees. Well, even if these markets are closed to Moscow, there are still other partners in the east. Trade with Beijing has been booming lately, going up by more than 40% in 2010. Plus, the sides ratified an agreement that will see China buying 31 million tonnes of Russian oil annually. Geopolitical analyst Patrick Henningsen believes any sanctions on Russia will become a bitter blow for the West.
In terms of any sanctions from the EU, there's no chance whatsoever. It's all bark and no bite. You know, as far as Washington goes, if they do impose sanctions, there's huge ramifications here for progress that's been made globally in the last century, and that's the restart of the START Treaty in 2010. That's certainly in jeopardy if Washington keeps an aggressive stance on this. And you have also the Nuclear Threat Initiative and a lot of joint programs between the West and Russia regarding the nuclear arsenal, nuclear proliferation. So is Washington really serious, and they're willing to throw all that away to go? So we're going to start the clock back in, what, 1979? That's what I see happening with this talk coming out of Washington.
The question now is, can the West afford its own sanctions? That is the theme of Venture Capital, with Katie Pilbeam coming your way in about 10 minutes' time. Venezuela's foreign minister says the US has directly encouraged the violent protests that have already taken 28 lives in the South American country. That followed the words of US Secretary of State John Kerry, who claimed that Caracas was waging a terror campaign against its own nation. And while Caracas justifies the actions of its security forces by blaming the US, Washington in turn claims Venezuela has found a scapegoat for its internal problems. President Nicolas Maduro warned protesters to clear a central square in the capital that's turned into their stronghold. Otherwise, they would be forcibly evicted. Venezuela analyst Gregory Wilpert believes America is fueling the ongoing unrest.
I don't think there's any chance that the government will be overthrown by these protests or anything like that, but certainly the U.S. government is supporting the opposition by both financially and by giving it moral support and encouragement. As a matter of fact, just recently the U.S. Senate is passing a resolution that would freeze assets of Venezuelan government officials. So this is kind of things that only encourages the opposition. And I think it contributes to a large extent why the protests haven't died down yet. At the same time, we know if we go through the list of people who've been killed so far and wounded in these protests, they are by and large people who were wounded and killed by the own opposition forces and not by the police forces. A very, very small minority are directly attributable to the police force.
In other news this week, a series of earthquakes in the US state of Ohio have brought shale gas extraction or fracking to a halt. An investigation has been launched into whether the tremors were caused by the controversial technique. Around 1,000 people in another state, California, have staged a protest against the fracking that has been dubbed as the biggest US action of this kind. This came as an echo of previous demonstrations in the UK that had also been described as record-breaking. This had no effect, though, on the EU Parliament. It voted for tougher environmental checks on oil and gas exploration, but excluded shale gas. Well, Europe remains divided over the issue. Among European countries, it's Britain and Poland who are pushing most aggressively to develop the industry, with Spain and Romania following their lead. Yet other states like Germany, France and Bulgaria have decided to put it on hold. Green activist Sharon Wilson explained why people are so against fracking.
There actually has been quite a bit of research, and we do know that fracking causes a lot of harm. Fracking-enabled drilling has tremendous emissions. The methane is bad for our climate. We do know that water is getting contaminated, and 86% of Americans want clean, renewable energy resources. Anyone who watched what's happening in the United States and in Australia and Canada would know that there are too many problems to go forward with this at this time.